Oi, amigos e amigas do Carta Capital, é um prazer estar com vocês novamente. Hoje eu trago para vocês uma entrevista que eu fiz com o Kristinn Hrafnsson, o editor-chefe do Wikileaks. Eu tive a oportunidade de conversar com ele aqui no nosso novo estúdio quando ele esteve no Brasil no mês passado como parte de uma turnê para a América Latina com o objetivo de obter apoio na defesa de Julian Assange. Ele esteve, inclusive, com o presidente eleito Lula, que se manifestou de forma bastante veemente em defesa de Assange e não para a primeira vez. Como você sabe, Julian está preso na Inglaterra, numa prisão de segurança máxima, conhecido como Guantánamo britânico, e pode ser deportado para os Estados Unidos a qualquer momento. Uma extradição para os Estados Unidos seria catastrófica e um dos maiores ataques à liberdade de imprensa no Ocidente nas últimas décadas. É muito importante que a gente esteja atento a esse assunto e por isso eu trago aqui junto com a Carta Capital essa entrevista com legendas em português para o público brasileiro. Um grande abraço para vocês e até o próximo. I'm really delighted to welcome for our interview segment the Editor-in-Chief of Wikileaks, Kristinn Hrafnsson, who is here with us in the studio, not even by video. Kristinn, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to see you. So obviously, Julian, being such a charismatic figure, is known to most people for his founding of and role in building Wikileaks. And what I often remind people is that Wikileaks is not just Julian. There's a large team that has always been working alongside him, and you're one of those key people. So if we can begin by talking a little bit about the role that you've played in working with Wikileaks and your responsibility for its growth, I think that would be helpful.
Well, I was working on the mainstream media as a journalist and had been for 20 years when I first met Julian in 2009. I'm an Icelandic journalist, and Wikileaks came to the attention of the Icelandic nation actually in 2009 when they got hold of internal documents for the failed Icelandic banks that went under in 2008, and my country went through an economic meltdown basically. And this leak, the internal bank leak from Wikileaks in 2009, was the biggest financial story and explained why this all happened. And he became a celebrity. He was invited to Iceland, and people wanted to know more about him and the philosophy. So, and I sought him out, and we befriended, and we spent a lot of time together in this winter 2009 and 10. And I was still working as a broadcasting journalist. At one day in a cafe where when the rain was pouring down the windows in my dreadful city, he said, I got to show you something. And he flipped open a computer and showed me the collateral murder video. The rest is history. And
which was, for those who don't remember, was the video showing U.S. pilots gunning down, I think, 12 or 13 people, including 2 journalists, one of whom worked for Reuters, and that was the first video that really brought WikiLeaks onto the map. Could you talk about the role that you played in some of the reporting that was done? Because I think a lot of people don't understand how much reporting, actual just standard journalism, goes into WikiLeaks releases.
Well, this release was the first of the bombshell releases of 2010 that continued into 2011 and are the basis of the indictment against Julian Assange. It came out on April 5th, 2010. I worked for weeks in analyzing the video, going through all the details of the story and try to figure out what had happened, what we were actually watching on that, the horrible images on the screen. And in the end, before the video was released, I traveled with a camera crew to Baghdad to actually seek out the people who were affected, who lost their relatives, and the 2 children which were injured in the attack, children who lost their father, in the part of the video which is obvious to everybody is an absolute war crime. So that was the journalism part, and we released all that alongside the video. And that sort of set the tone. Then, in the middle of the summer, it was the field reports from the Afghan war, from the military, and that, of course, at that point, there was a bigger media alliance where we got on board The Guardian and the New York Times and Der Spiegel, and the alliance then sort of broadened out to broadcasting when published the Iraq reports in the October same year. But internally there was always editorial work done on this material, alongside with the journalists that we got on board in the Media Alliance. And there's been a lot of talk about data dumping. There was never any data dumping done. That is the misconception that is constantly being pushed out there as a propaganda, as an irresponsible data dumping. I can say as a journalist for 20 years before meeting Julian and coming on board that on this journey is that probably I was often at odds with Julian. I thought he was too careful, So, I mean, there was redactions, there were considerations to put into place, and a lot of discussions with the media partners and internally. And often our media partners were actually pushing in the other direction.
Greater release.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I had the same experience in the Snowden reporting where, people to this day think we released indiscriminately all this information, when in fact there was a constant effort to decide what should and shouldn't be released, in a way that I learned, from WikiLeaks that you guys were doing in those first set of releases that made WikiLeaks so famous. But even subsequent releases, including in 2016 or 2017, when you released this these major revelations about the CIA and some of the ways in which it's spying, a lot of those documents were also heavily redacted or withheld. Talk about that process as well.
Well, I was not that much involved in the 2016-2017 releases, but if you think about, for example, the Vault 7 release about exposing the spying tools of the CIA, which was a very explosive story, but it didn't get much pickup. I have to admit that it was somehow went under the radar. Maybe people were getting too much used to the fact that everybody is spying on everybody in this Snowden release in 2013. But in those document releases, I mean, the misconception is that we exposed the tools, we made the spying tools, the code available, which is simply not correct. It was just the description of these tools and that they existed. But one of very many misconceptions in what people think WikiLeaks are, and that's the annoying part. That this is propaganda. This is the Pentagon line. This is what is being pushed out constantly, and it just seeps in and sort of sticks onto the WikiLeaks label, irresponsibly, non-journalistic, data dumping, and etc. When factually it's simply wrong. And you talk about criticism. I mean, I remember when we were releasing the Iraq war logs, and I was involved in sort of managing the Media Alliance through the Guardian and the newspapers on the ground, and the Al Jazeera TV station that was involved as well, both Arabic and English. When the material came out, everybody went ballistic. Why are you it was too heavily redacted.
People were angry that you had withheld so much.
Withheld too much and too much reduction,
Exactly.
And there were actually examples where some of the material that we released redacted were released by other media outlets with less reduction. We were more careful.
It's ironic because I think I know I was actually sometimes questioning and even critical of my belief that too much was being withheld. And then when we did the Snowden reporting, Julian was certainly critical on the grounds that we withheld too much as well. Ironic that the perception was deliberately cultivated, albeit falsely, that in each case we were doing nothing but indiscriminately dumping, if not dumping with the intention to create harm. So, as I mentioned at the start, you're here with us in the new studio, and despite the fact that you're a European and therefore have mastered all sorts of words in Portuguese with way too little work, I find that annoying, but you are not actually Brazilian. You're traveling here through Brazil. Why is that? Why are you here in Brazil and South America more broadly?
Well, I mean, the short answer is this. Julian's case is coming to the end of all possibilities of getting a fair solution through the court proceedings. He is fighting extradition in London. Within weeks, actually, he could be extradited. We are now in a waiting period for the appeal court in London, the High Court, to give us the answer whether they will hear an appeal by Julian to push back against the extradition. If they decide not to hear the appeal, which would be scandalous in itself, then it's the Supreme Court who could quickly decide not to hear the case, not of importance to the public. And then
the Home Secretary could, within weeks or days even.
Yeah, under the worst case scenario, he could be on a plane to the US within weeks. So, in my perception, and I've been sitting in on all the proceedings in London, and all the extradition proceedings in London have exposed only one thing, and that's the fact that this is just not going to be won in a court. There's no justice to be had in courtrooms in London. It is obvious, and I don't have to mention the United States. I mean, that is one of the essence of the defense of Julian in fighting the extradition, that he will never be able to get a fair trial there. So we're running out of time. So we need to push this on a different level. And so I decided that we need to go on a tour and to shore up political support, because the only way to actually fight a political persecution is through political means. So we are now traveling through Latin America to get support from political leaders, from the civil society here, organizations, artists, and traveling to the core nations here in South America, and we'll end in Mexico in the north side. So that is our aim, is to get political leaders to apply pressure, if you will call it that, or just to request the Biden administration to reconsider, to stand by their own ideals, the ideals that they preach around the world of press freedom, and not put this pressure on the First Amendment and their treaty commitments, and basically drop the charge against Julian. That's the only way out. So
I want to talk in just a second about the Biden administration and the Justice Department's posture towards this case. But before I do, as part of this trip, you were able to meet with the president-elect of Brazil, Lula da Silva. I think people sometimes forget what an important country Brazil is geostrategically. It's the 6th most populous country in the world, the 2nd largest in the hemisphere, has enormous petroleum reserves, as well as the Amazon, makes Brazil an extremely important country, always has been in the Cold War struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States. There was a coup engineered in Brazil by the CIA to overthrow a democratically elected government that ushered in a military dictatorship. And Lula has been extremely outspoken, not just now, but over the years, including when he himself was in prison on very dubious corruption charges, in his defense of Julian, constantly heralding him as a hero, talking about the critical work that WikiLeaks does, and insisting that any attempt to prosecute him would be a grave injustice. Why do you think it is that you have a leader in Brazil who doesn't get much political benefit by saying those sorts of things, so passionate and focused on WikiLeaks, and yet in the United States it's almost impossible to find a leftist or even center-left political figure on a national level, not Bernie, not AOC, no one from the squad, let alone a more mainstream Democrat, speak anywhere near as passionately or even at all in WikiLeaks' defense?
Well, I met Lula, and I mean, he comes across as a very warm and honest person, and I could sense that he feels passionate about it, as you say, and it's genuine. And the reason is, of course, that he has first-hand experience of the same kind of lawfare, persecution and imprisonment and injustice. So he can sense it on his own skin, the grave level of injustice that are being brought against Julian. So he is passionate about it on that front. In general, in this country, as you were talking about the history here, I've not spent many days, but what strikes me is that I don't have to convince anybody. I don't have to go to the sales pitch of telling people or explaining about what the CIA is capable of doing in political interference and planning assassination and kidnappings and what have you. Whereas in other countries, people set up sort of suspicious standards. Well, this is a conspiracy theory. You know, this region and this nation, of course, knows firsthand what the capabilities are to use these tools, and there's a big understanding. So that's, I think, that explains the general sympathy and understanding we have. And that reflects in Lula's position, which I admire him for. As you mentioned, there is there is not much for him to gain in many ways.
No, it's not a big political winner.
But he takes it very personally, and the fact that we the delegation from Wikileaks, we come to Brasilia in an extremely charged moment in the middle of the transition, where they are having all these difficulties, setting emergency law to actually expose the secrecy clauses of the Bolsonaro regime, and where we know that the Bolsonaro regime are making the transition very difficult.
No, they're still concerned about whether there will be an actual acceptance of the legitimacy of the election, and yet that's why I say in the middle of all that, Lula is making a point not only to meet with you, but to publicly manifest on behalf of Julian. I think there was a lot of reporting done as part of the Snowden archive about NSA spying on Brazil, on the then President Dilma Rousseff, who was Lula's handpicked successor, on its oil company Petrobras, on various agencies, and on the Brazilian people generally. And there were WikiLeaks releases about things that were done by the U.S. security state against Brazil as well. But I do think there's this interesting aspect that if you say that the CIA does bad things in the United States, not many people will rush to disagree with you. They'll be willing to kind of cursorily acknowledge that it's probably true, but they don't really feel in their bones the way people who have been on the other side of the CIA's actions or the U.S. intelligence agency's actions, the true magnitude of it. And anyone who feels that, I think, will automatically be receptive to the need for this kind of transparency in a way that people in the United States who still, even though they don't want to admit it, kind of have this implicit trust in the CIA. So let me ask you, regarding the U.S., Julian has now been imprisoned for more than 3 years in London, despite the fact that he has never been charged, or convicted of, rather, of a crime by the U.S. government. The only crime he was convicted of in the UK was a bail dumping charge where he got 11 months as long ago, served that time, and yet he's still in prison for going on more than 3 years now. They wouldn't let him out pending a trial the way they normally do. Do you think there's any validity to the theory that the U.S. government, the Justice Department, doesn't really want to bring Julian onto U.S. soil because of how much of a kind of sideshow, how much turbulence, how much bad imagery that will present to put somebody who is one of the most consequential journalists in the world on trial for espionage, in prison, having people protest outside, this huge distraction at best, a kind of real compromising of U.S. soft power, I think as well, that what they really wanted to do was just kind of break him physically and psychologically by keeping him in prison for as long as they can, and that there's really no desire to bring him to the U.S. Do you think there's validity to that theory?
Partly, I think it's correct that there is a little desire to have a trial in the U.S. Partly because of the sympathy towards him and his cause, but also the media would have a field day and would actually be forced to put some attention to the arguments that Julian can put on the table to prove the violations against him. And it's not a pretty story, It is something that has not gotten a lot of attention in the mainstream media in the U.S. So I don't think there's a huge desire to get the case to the U.S. And it might partly explain why there's been this endless delay to keep the process going. And we could call it simply the punishment through process, or lawfare, or whatever you call it. And I think there's a validity in that position. But enough is enough. This has been going on for way too long. 3.5 years now in a maximum security prison. And the United Kingdom
with no conviction.
I think he's the longest serving remand prisoner in UK history in latter times, which is
And he's not in an easy prison. He's in a prison that the BBC in 2004 referred to as the British Guantanamo. It's a prison that's used for terrorist suspects or people convicted of terrorist crimes. And I want to talk about how things are going for him in a second. And before we do, just on this political front, one of the bizarre aspects of this case is that
I've heard so many times people say that Julian is a traitor, that he's guilty of treason, as though he's a citizen of the United States, when in reality he has almost no connection to the United States. I think he's been in the United States maybe once or twice at most for a few days. He's a citizen of Australia. Usually when a citizen of a country is caught in a situation like this, with the US and the UK imprisoning him in such controversial ways, the government is outspoken in defense of its own citizen. The Australian government has notably been quite unsupportive. Lately, though, there seem to be some changes. Are these changes cosmetic? Are they part of this sort of attempt to give the US an out, to say, okay, well, Australia is willing to take him back and wants him back? Or is there a real change in government sentiment towards Julian?
Well, Prime Minister Albanese was supportive of Julian before he took office and his party came to power earlier this year. Incidentally, only a few days ago, he was asked a question in Canberra, in Australia, in Parliament about his position, what he was going to do for Julian, and he said that he would use diplomatic means to end this. That enough is enough, he said, and. So we have to see how that sort of works out in the diplomatic relations. But there has been a lot of reluctance in Australia, and especially this period where the Conservatives were controlling the country. But there's an indication that there's a changed atmosphere and possibly an increased pressure on the US from Australia, but the interest there, the geopolitical interest, of course, are huge. We have the situation in the South China Sea, defense interest. Australia is part of the Five Eyes spy program of 5 nations, etc., etc. But I thought it was interesting that actually this comment from Prime Minister Albanese came the day after Lula came out so outspoken in the support, and as you said earlier, you cannot just dismiss Brazil as a player, and especially Lula, who has had this
giant on the world stage,
remarkable resurrection, and you could see that on COP27, and you could see that when in the response from like President Macron, who called him up in like there was Christmas time.
Yeah, so that was really worrying me. I've been waiting for this call. Exactly.
So I mean, he is, and if you look at the modern history, I mean, this is one of the most spectacular comeback in politics in the world, and Brazil is a powerful player, and many who have been worried about the rising trend of the far right or the neo-fascist or even just fascist. I don't care what you even call it. In Europe, in many countries, you see Italy rising in Spain, Hungary, Poland, and a lot of people in my part of the world are seeing actually a glimpse of hope in the pushback with Lula's victory, and that should not be underestimated. There is now for these interests and for also geopolitical interests, there is a focus now on Latin America. I want to mention here that before we came to Brazil, I met with the president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, who said, well, the Americans are now listening to us. And even this spectacular moment at COP27 when President Macron again was embracing Maduro, who was persona non grata until oil interest kicks in.
Yeah, I mean, South America is more important than ever for Europe, yes, for the U.S., and that gives South American leaders a lot more leverage. So we only have I don't have a lot of time left, so I want to make sure to ask you this. Yep. When the indictment was first unveiled against Julian, it was, I think, about 6 weeks before I was contacted by the person who became my source for the stories that we were able to do that showed that Lula's conviction was corrupt and that ultimately freed him from prison. And at the time, I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post warning, trying to get other journalists to see the dangers that this indictment would essentially allow the criminalization of all investigative journalists, because what it alleged that Julian did that served as the basis for the indictment is something investigative journalists do routinely.
Yeah.
And ironically, the Brazilian government tried to prosecute me for that reporting that we ended up doing that freed Lula, and used a very similar theory against me that the U.S. government is using with Julian, namely that he crossed a line by working too closely with his source in a way that made him part of the conspiracy, which was the exact theory they tried to use to criminalize my journalism as well. Can you talk directly to the people who don't understand, especially in my profession, why this case extends far beyond WikiLeaks and really implicates the core foundational principles of whether we can have a free press?
Well, this is basically criminalizing journalism. I mean, it's very simple, and every journalist worth his salt should actually recognize that fact. It is criminalizing the journalist-source relation. And if you look at the indictment, that little part of it, which is which sometimes is called wrongly the hacking charges, there is no hacking alleged in the indictment. Julian is not even indicted on that. It's that he has somehow helped the source to commit the crime. But all these arguments have been torn apart. But when you carefully look at this and you see the danger, and this is the reason why the International Federation of Journalists and most Free Press Association have come on board and say that there's a huge danger in this for general journalistic practices. If you look through the wording of the indictment, I mean, it is almost, it's ridiculous. One, for example, which is supposed to support this allegation of conspiracy is alleged interaction between the journalist Julian Assange, they assume, and Chelsea Manning, where Chelsea says something of the nature, well, I think I'm dry, meaning that there's no more information. And the reaction is on the other side, which they assume is Julian, and haven't even proving that. In my experience, curious eyes never run dry, quote unquote. I want to put that on a T-shirt. What journalist hasn't said to a source, "Get me more"? Get me more.
It's the nature of what a journalist would do.
That's exactly what you're supposed to be doing.
And that's why I say that when you're talking about using things like that are so basic to the journalist-source relationship, I mean, of course, when a source comes to you and gives you things that are incredibly important, you want more. That's what you want to dig more. You want to find more. That's your job, the role, your function as a journalist. If you can criminalize that, you can criminalize any journalist.
And you talk about the precedent that was set, and you actually suffered through the Bolsonaro approach in your case, which was basically a copy-paste of Julian. So that is one precedent. So we're always talking about if he's extradited, that will set a precedent, but it's already there. It has, shortly after the editorial offices of the state broadcaster in Australia were raided, and computers were confiscated in an attempt to go after a source, and you could see examples over the world. It sort of had a rippling effect, and on the other side of the coin is the fact that despotic regimes have been using the Assange example as an excuse to suppress press freedom in their part of the world. You had the spokesman of the Russian Foreign Ministry, the Chinese authorities, and even the president of Azerbaijan telling off a BBC reporter, why are you criticizing what's going on in my country when you have Julian Assange, a respected journalist, imprisoned in a dungeon in southeast London? So it's
impossible to answer. I mean, it doesn't make that despot any less despotic, but it certainly means that the United States has no moral credibility, or the UK or European countries supporting this, to lecture anyone about the importance of press freedom. I just have a couple more questions because we're nearing the end of our time. One of the things I heard for years, and still do hear when defending Edward Snowden, is, well, look, if you're so sure that he acted heroically, why doesn't he come back and try and convince a jury of his peers that that's true, instead of staying hiding? Now, you referenced earlier what you said is your view that Julian would never get a fair trial in the U.S., either because they're charging him under a 100-year law that was enacted in 1917, the Espionage Act, to criminalize dissent against World War I, and is written in order to assure prosecution, but the same law they're charging Snowden with. But beyond that, what are the reasons you believe when people say, well, why doesn't Julian just come out of that hole in Ecuador, or in the Ecuadorian embassy, or now agree to be extradited? If he's so clearly right, he'll be acquitted. Why is that untrue? Why won't he get a fair trial?
Well, look at the venue, just for that matter. You called to be judged by his peers. So, you know, the venue is the Eastern District of Virginia court, what they call the spy court. And for what reason? 80% of the jury pool is actually drawn from people who have either direct or indirect, through, you know, one link, a family member, a close associate, who works for these agencies, who have an interest in the case. So it's absolutely impossible to get a fair trial just on that simple basis. And we have 10 more arguments to pile on top of that. You know, the breach of the attorney-client privileges, the stealing of the legal documents, the spying of the meetings that Julian had with his lawyers whilst he was in the Ecuadorian embassy, conducted by the CIA under Mike Pompeo, the plot to assassinate or kidnap him that has been exposed now a year ago in September
by a very credible reporter, Mike Isikoff.
Based on 30 sources, named and unnamed, nobody has claimed credibly that this is not a reliable report. Very, very, very solid reporters, and actually, in a very spectacular manner, Mike Pompeo, former director of CIA, actually confirmed the story in a way by not denying the authenticity of it, or saying this is all BS, it's simply not true. No, he went the other way and said, we need to get the sources of the story and put them on trial for breaching confidentiality. Well, thank you, Mike Pompeo. You just confirmed the authenticity of the story by doing that. So, and on we can go about the impossibility of him getting a fair trial, including with all the outspoken condemnation of him by political leaders, by everybody in society. How are you going to get an impartial jury together to take the case on? And let's not forget the other thing. He is going to be put on pre-trial detention in the U.S., which can last for 2-3 years, that period. Who will decide and can decide the condition in which he is held in that pre-trial period? That is the CIA. They can demand that he is put in solitary confinement through the entire time.
Under laws that were created after 9/11 to ensure that anyone who's accused of being a national security risk is basically put into a dungeon. Before I ask you my last question, I just want to note one thing interesting that you said, and important, I think, is that there's always been this paradox that Julian is very popular, and the cause of WikiLeaks is very popular among Trump's base, the people kind of who identify their politics not as a Republican but as a MAGA supporter or a Trump supporter, and yet this prosecution was not started by the Biden administration. They're certainly pursuing it aggressively. It was started under the Trump administration and was clearly led by Mike Pompeo, who gave a speech in 2017 as the director of the CIA before he became the Secretary of State, in which he vowed that he will do everything to ensure the destruction of WikiLeaks, and argued that WikiLeaks does not have any First Amendment rights. And I think it's important to note that Mike Pompeo and the Trump administration were not bystanders in this, but Pompeo himself is really the person most responsible for the fact that these criminal charges are pending. Let me just ask you as the last question. Obviously, this case is really polarizing politically. Julian and WikiLeaks are polarizing. There are important legal implications, geopolitical implications, all of which we've discussed. There's obviously a really important personal component as well that I don't want to overlook, which is we're talking about a human being, Julian Assange, who has effectively now been in various forms of detention for more than a decade, despite never having been convicted of a crime. WikiLeaks was never convicted of a crime. His only crime, as I said, was bail jumping because he sought legal refuge and asylum and obtained it by a sovereign state in Ecuador. What has that done to him? How is he doing physically? How is he doing in terms of his mental health? There's been reports that he has suffered many strokes. There have been doctors warning that further detention of this kind could easily kill him or break him mentally forever. How is he doing?
Well, Julian is an extremely resilient individual, and he is getting by, but I worry about him. I mean, he's a good friend of mine. I visit him in prison regularly. I'm one of the two people outside his family and lawyers that are able to visit, and I worry for him every time I leave the prison. I mean, it's taking a toll. 3.5 years in this maximum security prison. Before that, 7 years in the Ecuador embassy, and then before that, house arrest. So of course, it's taking a toll, and it's about the time it ends. I want to throw in just one thing, which I think is of interest. It hasn't gotten any attention. The simple fact that demanding his extradition is a violation of the United States, United Kingdom extradition treaty, which has been in force for, I think more than 100 years. Because that treaty exempts extradition for political offenses. And so you can't charge a man with the purest form of a political offense, which is espionage, and then demand extradition on the basis of the treaty that actually exempts that. And interestingly enough, this was pointed out a few days ago to me, that in 1985, then Senator Joe Biden was vigorously opposing the extradition of a suspected IRA, terrorists in those days, from the US to Margaret Thatcher's government. Ronald Reagan, what was at the time, was trying to twist the treaty to facilitate the extradition of this suspected IRA terrorist to London. Joe Biden rallied in the Senate and they were able to stop it. And there's a letter that is now circulating online in the Irish media pointing that fact out, that he claimed that this was the holiest of every holy rule. You don't take away this security measurement in the extradition treaty. We don't touch it. We even let some bad guys go. We don't touch that rule.
Because it's not just a unique aspect of British, U.S. extradition law, it's a general principle in extradition law internationally. So before I let you go, you mentioned that the key thing people can do is political pressure. That's the most important thing now, as opposed to any chance to get justice in a court of law. Is there anything else that you want people to know? And I'm sure people watching are going to be wondering, well, if political pressure matters, what is it that I should be doing or could be doing?
Well, just familiarize yourself with the case and try to dive through the smokescreen and get to the core of the case, which is the press freedom issue in it, which people here in Latin America on our tour here have no problem actually fathoming. It's so near their heart. They understand what's at stake here. And our mission in this Latin American tour is to meet the leaders of the countries here, and I want to be able to say that when it ends, that the entire continent stays firmly behind the cause, not just for Julian Assange, but what this case stands for. It is the most gravest attack on press freedom in modern times.
Kristinn, thank you so much for taking the time. I know you have an incredibly busy schedule as you travel through South America. It was great to meet you in person and to be able to talk about what I also regard as the most important press freedom case of our generation. So thanks very much.
Thanks for having me, Glenn.